So, I've been thinking about a scene from Dante's Divine Comedy. Now, if you've never read Dante's Divine Comedy, don't worry. You don't need to know much about it to understand my point. In the story, Dante's on a journey through the afterlife, and for much of that journey, he's guided by this ancient Roman poet named Virgil. Virgil appears as a shade or a spirit of a dead man. He's wise, he's respected, he's educated and famous, and he's very thoughtful. In many ways, he's meant to represent the very best of human wisdom and philosophy. So Virgil guides Dante through hell. He guides him up the mountain of purgatory. He explains what Dante is seeing and helps him understand the journey. But eventually, they reach a point where Virgil has to stop. He's not permitted to go any further. He actually can't enter paradise. He can't bring Dante into the presence of God. Not because he's foolish, not because he's evil, not because he has done anything, that was wrong, or, it's not that he hasn't even given worthwhile teaching to the world. He ends up having to stop because human wisdom can only take a person so far. That's the symbol there. And I've thought about that scene a lot over the years, especially as a chaplain, because I think it says something important about our own culture. The Western world is fascinated with things like Stoicism. It's fascinated with positive psychology and self-help, manifestation, resilience training, and every other movement that promises greater mastery over self and greater control over life. Now, before I go any further, let me be clear. I'm not saying there's nothing useful to learn from these sorts of things. I've got 2 psychology degrees myself. I've spent years studying how people think, how habits form, beliefs influence behavior, and all of that such. And I think that there's value in understanding those things. But I've also spent years sitting across from Marines and sailors who were just simply exhausted. Not because they weren't trying, but because they were. They'd done what they were told. They'd put in the work. They'd practiced the exercises, tried the techniques, worked hard to gain greater control over their thoughts, emotions, and reactions. And many of them carried something deeper than sadness. They now carried shame, because somewhere along the way they'd absorbed the message that if they were still struggling, if they were still burdened, if they still felt anxious, angry, lonely, or discouraged, then the problem must be in them. They weren't doing enough, weren't trying hard enough, weren't mastering themselves well enough. And friends, that's a crushing burden to place on a human being. The reason these ideas are so popular is because they all appeal to the same desire, the desire for control. Whether it's Stoicism, positive psychology, manifestation, or any one of the number of help and self-improvement movement philosophies out there, the promise is often the same. Gain more control and you'll gain more peace. But Christians need to be careful, very careful, because these systems are often half-truths. And half-truths can be more dangerous than outright lies because they sound wise enough to trust. The Stoics noticed real things about human nature. Psychology has discovered useful things about human behavior. But if a system begins with man and never reaches God, then eventually it reaches a dead end, a point past which it can't travel with us. And that's exactly where many people find themselves. Reality eventually refuses to cooperate with their efforts to master and control themselves and the world. And the grief doesn't disappear. Their betrayals still hurt, loneliness still remains, and all of the positive thinking in the world just doesn't change any of those things. What's worse is that when these systems fail to deliver what they promised, like I said, people don't blame the system, they wind up blaming themselves. And so they're carrying not only the original suffering they were trying to alleviate, they're now carrying shame about being unable to alleviate the suffering using the philosophies, the programs, and the techniques that we've all foisted upon them. But this really shouldn't surprise us. The temptation underneath all these ideas is actually quite ancient. It's not new. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Remember how the devil, appearing in the form of the serpent, lies to the couple. You will be like God. That's always been the temptation, friends, to become the master, to become the authority, to become the one who gets to determine reality. And that's why I honestly don't understand Christianity's fascination with Stoicism or its growing fascination with all the various forms of positive psychology. Again, I'm not saying there's nothing to learn from them. I'm saying they're only halfway there. They can tell us something about ourselves, but they can't answer the biggest questions because they can't tell us what God has already revealed. And if we're not careful, we'll start expecting those philosophies to carry weights that they were never designed to carry. The scriptures take a very different approach. The Bible never tells us that peace comes from becoming masters of ourselves. The Bible points us to the God who rules over all things. The Bible doesn't teach us to deny suffering or explain it away. It teaches us to bring our suffering to God. That's why the Psalms are filled with laments. That's why Job has to sit in anguish and cry out in confusion. That's why the prophets grieve. That's why Jesus himself is described by Isaiah the prophet in chapter 53, verse 3, as a man of sorrows who's acquainted with grief. Christianity doesn't tell us to pretend reality is different than it is. Christianity tells us that reality belongs to God. And I've seen something remarkable happen when people finally understand that. I've watched Marines and sailors stop trying to carry burdens they were never meant to carry. I've watched exhausted people realize they're not responsible for controlling every outcome or understanding every hardship or even somehow forcing life to make sense because they're not God. And they were never supposed to be. And what sounds like a defeat to the world actually often becomes a source of freedom for Christians. Because when you stop trying to sit on God's throne, you can finally rest in the one who already occupies it. That's why I keep thinking about Virgil. Virgil wasn't a fool. He just reached the limits of what human wisdom could do. And that's my concern for Christians today. Read the Stoics if you'd like. Learn what you can from psychology. Study human behavior. There's value in all those things. Just don't ask them to go with you further on the journey than they're able to. Don't ask them to save you. Don't ask them to answer questions that they just cannot answer. Because eventually, they're going to have to stop where Virgil stopped. They're going to take you part of the way, and then they'll run out of road. And that's where Jesus Christ is different. Christ doesn't simply help us understand suffering, he enters it. Christ doesn't tell us to carry our burdens better, he invites us to bring them to him. And after years of talking with Marines and sailors, I've become convinced that's what so many people are actually looking for. Not another method, a self-help program, not another framework or therapy, not another promise that if you do X, Y, and Z, or follow steps 1, 2, and 3, you'll finally achieve self-mastery. What they're looking for is a God they can trust when life simply refuses to cooperate, when the reality in front of you will not change, bend, break just because you want it to. And thanks be to God, that's exactly what the gospel gives us. The gospel gives us a transcendent God who provides meaning for all things, even when he doesn't grant us understanding of all things. And so, my friends, I pray that that's where we fall when we must fall. Not onto the human philosophies, not onto the educated but limited options that the greatest minds in humanity have given us, but onto the revelation of God, the Bible, the scriptures, the truth that the Holy Spirit can guide us into. Because that's where there's peace. That's where we'll find rest from our burdens. Not because the burdens are gone, not because we've reframed them, not because we've taken control of them. but because the God who has all authority in heaven and on earth tells us, be still, I've got this. All right, my friends, stay ready, stay steady, and stay anchored. God bless you.